In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be going through some information that relates to Shadows of the Erdtree that was revealed today from a lot of hands-on previews that have gone live. Unfortunately, I was unable to attend this event, so a lot of this information is just gathered from places around the internet, but I want to go into some things because we've been talking regularly on this channel about how to prepare for the DLC, what's that mean for your build, etc. And now that we have some factual information about how some of the mechanics work, I want to get into that. So the first thing is that the DLC begins after you touch the Hand of Miquella in Mohg's Palace. We knew this already, but this is 100% confirmed now, so that's how you're going to begin that. And something I found particularly interesting is that during the hands-on preview session, that everyone was started on a level 150 character. This would lead me to believe that that's roughly the difficulty that is recommended for you. I will note that somebody mentioned that you can do it at lower levels if you have a good enough build, etc. But it seems to be that, you're going to be between a level 100 to 150 when you go into the DLC, or that's the recommended level, ideally, for players to tackle this content in. So you should probably keep that in mind if you are, an average Elden Ring player, that you're going to want to have a build or a character that's kind of around that level. And another thing that was mentioned is that the difficulty of the DLC is similar difficulty to the end game in Elden Ring, or some of the later game areas like Mountaintops of the Giants or Erdtree, Miquella's Erdtree area. So if those were difficult areas for you, then basically that's how it begins in the DLC. This would lead me to believe that the DLC is going to be much harder than the base game is in general, and that's probably to compensate for the fact that players are more familiar with Elden Ring now, and they understand some of the game's mechanics a bit better, having played it a lot more. So they're probably increase the difficulty in order to compensate for that. And if you've played any of From Software's DLCs for any of their Dark Souls games, etc., these are typically harder, or they typically contain bosses that are much harder than the base game. At least some of the optional bosses tend to be. So the other thing that we've learned is that there are two items in the DLC. One is called the Erdtree Fragment, and one is called the Revered Spirit Ash. The Erdtree Fragment is found around the map in the Land of Shadow by exploration. You could think of these similarly to golden seeds or sacred tears, except it seems like they're usually around more enemies and they're not as easy to get from what I understand. But essentially what these items do is they boost your damage and reduce the damage that you take. I don't know exactly how much they boost your damage or reduce the damage you take. Some people have been speculating it's around 5% or so. So theoretically, as you gain more and more of these, you're going to increase your damage and take less damage. People were reporting that the enemies in the DLC hit harder, they have higher health pools, but that you don't have to use these in order to get through the DLC. You're basically changing the difficulty of the DLC more or less, depending on how many of these you gather and, how you tackle the content, right? Like theoretically, if you knew all the locations of these and you went and got them all quickly, the DLC is going to be much easier than if you're fighting your way through with just a couple of them, not knowing where they are and not worrying about picking them up. And you turn these in at sites of grace, again, similar to the way you do with golden seeds and sacred tears, needing more and more of them in order to increase your damage and reduce your damage taken. And you can't undo this, so once you've done it, it's done on your character. And again, this buff only applies to the Land of Shadow area. So if you get these and expect to go outside the Lands of Shadow and be stronger in the lands between, that's just simply not the case. So this is a buff that only applies here. And we've been speculating about this in our previous videos on how this was actually going to work, whether they were going to nerf your damage or not. And gladly, or luckily, I should say, they did not nerf your damage. So if you have a very high attack power focused build that, just hits like a truck and does lots of damage, you're only going to have a stronger build as you gain these things. And I think that means that just about any build in the DLC is going to be viable, that, you don't have to have some special build. But I will say, because the damage that these enemies deal is higher than, the vast majority of the base game of Elden Ring, and because they have higher hit pools or hit points than enemies in the base game on average, the builds that I suggested previously are probably still not a bad idea. And just a quick recap on what those are. These are builds that are focused around stance damage and status effect buildup like bleed, poison, frostbite, etc. I have not seen any reports from anyone that the mechanics of these have changed at all in the DLC area. So theoretically, these could work very, very well, particularly stance damage focused builds, I find. Because if an enemy is stance broken, then it cannot damage you. And even if its damage is high and its health pool is high, if it's rendered ineffective, by constantly staggering it, then you're going to be more successful. So I still recommend focusing on stance damage. Status effects probably still good because higher health pools means that status effects are going to deal more damage since those are based off the max health of enemies. But again, I want to reiterate that you can use any build because if you have a high attack power build, as you pick up these things, it's only going to get more and more effective. And it's possible by the end parts of the DLC that it'll actually be stronger than maybe a stance break build or a status effect build if you had high attack power to begin with. Obviously, that's going to depend a lot on how many of these that you pick up and turn in and if you know where they are. So probably subsequent playthroughs of the DLC, knowing where these things are that you can b-roll through them, obviously we'll have them on our interactive map, etc., is going to make it so that you have a much easier time, if you're going an attack power focused build. And another thing that I want to mention is that there are 8 new weapon types. We knew this already. We didn't know what they all were, but these are light great swords, hand-to-hand, beast claws, great katanas, perfume bottles, reverse hand swords, thrusting shields, and throwing weapons. And we also know that Shadow of the Erdtree is going to have 100 weapons or so total, roughly that amount, which is about a third of the base game. And if each one of these weapon categories has 5 or 6 weapons in it, this would mean that there's probably going to be 1 or 2 new weapons for each existing weapon type in Elden Ring. So for those of you that have a favorite weapon type, even though you want to try out some of the new ones, you can probably look forward to about 1 or 2 new weapons for each category, roughly. I'm super excited for that. I can't wait to get into more builds using the new weapons, also to do the new weapon categories, go through them and break them down. Every time I do a new weapon category video, I feel like I learn more and more about the balancing of Elden Ring as a whole. You can see how each weapon group, where it fits in its general attack rating to weight ratio, and how effective it is in combat. So I really look forward to doing those for those. And obviously, with the new weapons, we'll do videos covering them as well. I don't know if we'll do like a fresh video for the old weapon categories and show where these, factor into those or not, but we might do something like that as well. And the last thing I want to touch upon before wrapping up this video is DLC length. I know there's been a lot of speculation out there about just how long the DLC is going to be. From all indications, it seems like it's going to be huge. We know that there are more than 10 major bosses in the expansion, and this means on Margit level, Godric the Grafted level, Renala level bosses, there's at least 10 of those in there. And that doesn't factor in, any open world mini bosses or other bosses in the game. So that is a huge amount in my opinion. And based on what I've seen from some of the people attending the event, it seems like the amount of gameplay that you're going to get is probably in the 50 to 100 hours range, depending on how good of a player you are. Because the DLC is going to be harder than the base game, it might take average Elden Ring players like myself a bit longer to get through it than normal. And so I think that might extend your hours. You might be dying more than you were in the base game. Obviously, that depends on what your build is and whether you've taken some of my advice about stance damage and status effects, etc. But generally speaking, it's probably going to take you longer to get through a smaller area than it would in the base game. And before I forget, there is another item too that I was going to mention after the Erdtree fragment. But there is something called Revered Spirit Ash, and this also boosts the damage of your Spirit Ashes. It works very similarly to the Erdtree fragment, but it specifically boosts your Spirit Ash damage. So if you want your Spirit Ashes to become more effective, you're going to have to round those up and turn them in at Sites of Grace as well. So for those of you wondering how does it affect Spirit Ashes, that's how it's going to affect it. So that kind of wraps up my video on a brief summary of the mechanical things. I tried to stay away from story elements and any other sort of spoilers from the things that I've seen out there. I definitely like covering that stuff, but that's not something you see on our channel very often. Very much more of a mechanical mind. I like to break down the mechanics. And again, we will have very soon, probably later this week, a video breaking down exactly what you should do based on this new information to prepare for Shadow of the Erdtree. And this will include, how to get golden seeds, where they're located, sacred tiers, what's effective level of leveling up, where should you get upgrade materials. If you're talking about creating a brand new character, what is it that you need to do? Or maybe you're on an existing character, but you haven't done all these things. We'll go into the exact specifics of things that you should do, so stay tuned for that. So what do you guys make of Shadow of the Erdtree? Did you guys watch the previews out there from other channels? What do you guys think so far, seeing more about it? Are you even more hyped? I know I am. Let me know in the comments below.